before we begin then, are there any questions or anything that we need to sort out? No? Okay, cool. First question, labour force 40% total population, unemployment 26%. What is the number of employed workers as a percentage of the total population? I get 29.6. Any issues with that? You guys happy with that? Yeah?
Can you explain how you got that, please?
Okay, explain what you are having trouble with, and then I can...
Well, I just said 100 minus 40%, so 60%. And then I said 6% times 26%, and I got 50.6.
Interesting, but I'm not sure exactly why you're doing that, but let me give you an example of what we're talking about. So if we know that here we've got unemployment rate is 26%, okay? So let's just, first of all, just throw in some variables. So let's call the labor force Y, let's call the total population Z, and then the unemployment rate is 26%, so let's call the number of unemployed X, in which case the number of employed is 1 minus X. You happy with that idea? Okay. Then X, which is the unemployed over Y, the labor force, so X over Y equals 0.26. You happy with that? In other words, 1 minus X over Y equals 0.74. Okay. So your 60%, I'm not quite sure where we're going with that, but now, obviously, if you've been told that labor force is 40% of total population, so in other words, Y over Z equals 0.4. Yeah? And what you're being asked for is this value here. Right? So then, are you happy that Y is equal to 0.4 Z? And Y is also equal to 1 minus X divided by 0.74. Which means 1 minus X divided by 0.74 is equal to 0.4Z. So 0.4 times 0.74Z equals 1 minus X, right? So 0.74 times 0.4 should give you 0.296. Any issues? Anything else? Do you want me? Anyone unhappy about that explanation or what you're being asked for or anything else? Any other issues? Okay. Consider the following graph showing inflation in South Africa. When do we have deflation? Well, in order to have deflation, we need inflation to be negative, and at no point on the scale is inflation negative. Therefore, there is no deflation. Any issues or questions? Okay. So the following is incorrect. The labor force is the number of people in full employment. Is that correct? Formal employment. Is that the labor force? No. The participation rate is defined as the ratio of the labor force to the total working age population. Correct or incorrect? Correct, yeah. Okay, deflation is said to occur when the general price level increases at a slower rate. Is that what deflation is? No, as I say, deflation is when it's negative. Inflation only occurs during an expansion. No, not necessarily. Okay, so which ones are incorrect? 1, 3, and 4. Any questions or issues? Question number 4, the prices for which of the following goods are included in both the GDP deflator and the consumer price index? So goods bought by households, right? That goes into both because obviously the consumer price index is all about what are the goods that households buy. Goods that are bought by firms, well, they won't necessarily go into the CPI. Goods bought by governments don't necessarily go into CPI. Foreign households, again, don't necessarily go into CPI. So the only thing we've got is A. Okay. So I'll leave it up to you then to just shout at me if you've got a problem with something. Okay? An advance in technology and an increase in the working age population. So if you've got changes, well, first of all, we're dealing with labor supply and labor demand curves. If you've got a change in technology, that's going to shift demand, labor demand. Increase in working age population, that's going to affect labor supply. Are you going to have a rightward shift in labor supply? Yes. Are you going to have a rightward shift in labor demand? Yes. Are you going to have a rightward shift in labor supply and labor demand? Yes. In other words, C is correct. A and B don't include either the demand or the supply side effect, so C is the one that you want to be going for here. Remember, when we talk about a movement along a curve, what we mean is that the curve is not shifting. So obviously we're saying that these curves are shifting, so it's not D. And in terms of E, a movement along a production function, well, the entire production function is shifting. So it's not just a movement along, it's a shift in the production function. So you have this production function, and you're told that you're at point A. That's where you start. It says everyone has to do 4 years of education, an extra 4 years of education, which is going to make you more productive. If that happens, where are you going to move from point A? Well, remember, if you've got a productivity change, then you have both a shift in the PPF and movement along the PPF, because what's happening in your labor market, you've got your labor demand, labor supply, right? And a shift in production, an increase in productivity shifts the labor demand curve. Right? So you have an increase, right, in the quantity, the equilibrium quantity of labor. Okay? So it's a movement, and the shift in the labor demand shifts the entire production function. So you've got a movement from points A to points D. So a move towards point D. Continuing with that diagram, from point A in the preceding diagram, if the population increases, what do we expect the economy to do? So in other words, if we just have a change in labor supply without any change in productivity, what do we have? We don't have any shift in the production function, we just have a movement along the production function. So you're going to have a move towards point B. Question 8, you've got all this information, the calculation's pretty straightforward. You got obviously C plus I plus G plus X minus M is equal to C plus S plus T. It's asking you for S, and it's giving you every single other one of those variables. So it's pretty straightforward to calculate what S is. S is equal to, I think, 25. You happy with that? In other words, you've got here C, they've given you C, it's 80. You've got government expenditure, so you've got government. You've got household income tax, there's T. You've got gross domestic investment, there's I. You've got imports, M. You've got exports, X. And you need S. So. Any issues? No? Okay. Okay, then we've got a loan of funds markets. got an increase in expected profits, and you've got an increase in household disposable income. So if you've got an increase in household disposable income, that's going to shift your supply of loanable funds. If you've got an increase in expected profits, that's going to shift your demand for loanable funds. So what kind of movements would we have? Well, the only kind of movement that, in terms of this diagram, that reflects both those changes would be a move from point A to point C. So then if there is a decrease in household savings rates, we can expect equilibrium to move from point what to point what. So decrease in savings rates basically means that for any given income level you're saving less, so your supply of loanable funds is going to be shifting to the left. So let's just get rid of these things. Okay, if your supply is shifting to the left, there's a whole bunch of options. We could have D to A, or not really a whole bunch, but there's a couple of options. Or we could have C to B. Both of those would be okay. Do we have any of those options? Sorry. Well, we've got C to B. We don't have D to A, so that's the only option that's going to work for us. And then the next question is basically the same question, except the other way around. If there's an increase in savings rates, what happens? The supply of loanable funds curve is going to shift. It can only shift in one direction. It's going to shift from, let's get rid of these. Okay, increase in the savings rates. You must have a, whoa. I don't know what's going on there. Okay, so if you've got an increase, supply of loanable funds 0 to supply of loanable funds 1, A. So not the other way around, doesn't shift demand, and it does have an effect, so E is not correct. Okay. How's it looking so far, just as a matter of interest? Not so good? Okay. I mean, no one has asked any questions apart from the very first question, so I'm assuming then that you understand why you've got these things wrong and you know how to improve your performance. Or I'll see you back next semester. I don't know, either way, I guess. At some point you'll get it right. Okay. Which of the following explains why the demand for loanable funds is negatively related to the real interest rate? Okay, so the demand for loanable funds is downward sloping. Demand for loanable funds. Why is it downward sloping? Well, a lower interest rate makes more investment projects profitable. Happy with that? Yeah, that seems good. Consumers are willing to spend less and hence save more at a higher real interest rate. Well, that's really a description of why the supply of loanable funds is upward sloping. That's got nothing to do with describing why the demand for loanable funds is downward sloping. So it's not B. C, the interest rate flexibility in financial markets assures equilibrium in which saving equals investment. Okay, so great, that's a description of the equilibrium, or it's a description of how equilibrium is reached in the loanable funds market, but it's not a description of why the loanable funds curve is downward sloping. So it's not C, which means it's not D and it's not E, because we've got A over here, so that's pretty good. Which of the following is not a component of investment, of gross investment, sorry. So a purchase of a crane, I did get asked what a crane was. So I drew like this little picture, like, you know, like a crane, whatever. And the guy's like, construction equipment. It's like, yeah. Okay, cool. And then I just felt like an idiot, having gone through all this effort to draw a crane, and it's just like, all I needed to know was, what am I dealing with? Anyway, so purchase of a crane, yeah, that's part of investment. If you're purchasing shares, no. Construction of houses, that is part of investment, gross investment. Stockpiles, yeah, that's fine. And depreciation, well, in fact, depreciation is part of gross investment, so yeah. In other words, net investment is equal to gross minus depreciation. In other words, gross is equal to net plus depreciation. So gross includes depreciation. So which of the following is not? Well, option B. Happy? Okay. During a period of high inflation, are lenders worse off during high inflation, or are borrowers worse off? If you have inflation and you're lending people cash, are you better off or worse off if there is inflation? You're worse off, right? Cool. So yeah, lenders are worse off, borrowers are better off, yeah, borrowers are worse off, no. Lenders are better off, no. Okay? Lenders are worse off because they're repaid with currency that is worth more. Well, no, because they're worse off because it's worth less. So lenders are worse off because they cannot find anyone who wants a loan. No, it's got nothing to do with it. Borrowers are better off because they can pay off their loans with currency that is worth less. Yes, exactly. Cool. Great. Okay. When using the expenditure approach, and the key here was this idea of the expenditure approach. Expenditure approach. Which of the following reduces the value of GDP? So the first thing here is value added tax. So value added tax, VAT, it's got nothing to do with your expenditure approach. If you have a mining excavator that's imported, well, in terms of our expenditure approach, Y equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So in terms of measuring GDP in terms of the expenditure approach, imports would lower the value of GDP. If a storm destroys newly built homes, well, remember, investment here is gross investment. So if the storm destroys these things, it doesn't actually take into account whether, in other words, if they're built and then they get destroyed, that's not part of our measure of GDP, right? In other words, the only part that goes into measuring GDP, sorry, when I put G here, that's for gross, is the actual building of those homes. So destroying them has got nothing to do with measuring GDP. And the manufacturing sector inventory increases during the year. Well, inventory increases would be part of investment, but it would make output increase. So it wouldn't be one of the things that reduces the value of GDP. So in terms of these options, question 15E, which was a little bit tricky, I think. Okay. Yeah. Option 4. You want me to repeat in question 15, option 4, why it's incorrect? Okay. So the question is asking, when you're using this expenditure approach, which of these options reduces the value of GDP, right? If you have inventory, an increase in inventory, that would be part of the measure of investment, right? In other words, investment, it's gross investment, which includes fixed investment and inventory investment, right? So if inventory investment's going up, that's part of your investment going up. Your output would be going up, your GDP would be going up. It wouldn't be reducing our measure of the value of GDP. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah. Got you.
So let's say someone spends £1,000,000 for a new home and
Yeah.
it gets destroyed, then they're not going to have the money to spend. So then obviously that's going to affect their GDP because they won't have the money to spend. They would have to save more because they just lost £1,000,000.
Okay. It might affect future GDP, as you suggest. In other words, if that house is destroyed, that affects consumers' wealth, for example, and that decrease in wealth then leads to a decrease in consumption in, like, the next period or something. I mean, I'm happy with that. You're just kind of taking it a whole bunch of steps forward that for potential things which you haven't been told would happen. In other words, all we know is that these homes have been destroyed. It certainly has nothing to do with measuring the expenditure approach. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a speculation about it having a wealth effect, right? I'll think about it. I mean, you're not wrong. It's just a case of, any question you can speculate a whole bunch of things which you're not told, and then it's like, well, why would you speculate that? We could, in other words, speculate about anything, right? So I must just think about whether that's the kind of speculation that's, I don't know, unwarranted in a sense. Okay? Okay, question 16. Choose the correct combination to complete the missing values. All else equal, if your retirement age is reduced, some curve is going to shift somewhere. Would it be labor demand or labor supply that shifts if you are told that your retirement age has changed? Is it labor demand or labor supply? Labor supply, correct, okay. Doesn't shift labor demand, so it's not both, okay. Would the curve shift to the left or to the right? Left, cool. So we don't really need to check the last one, but basically, will the production function remain unchanged? Yes, cool. All else equal, which of the following will decrease the equilibrium real wage? So there's some kind of change in labor market regulation that increases working hours. If you've got an increase in working hours at any given wage rate, what happens? Labor supply shifts to the right. Will that decrease equilibrium real wage? Yes. Most of the economy's capital stock is destroyed, forcing workers at most factories to share the remaining machinery and equipment. Right? Destruction, in other words, this is like a negative technology shock. What happens? It shifts the demand for labor to the left. Shifting demand labor to the left, is that going to decrease the real wage? Yeah? You guys with me or not? Do I need to draw stuff? Can I get some feedback? Yeah? So the first one, you got labor demand, labor supply, new market regulation, so this is W and this is QL. New labor market regulation increases working hours, you got an increase in the supply of labor. Right? You happy with that? Okay. So this is a regulation that says that you have to work more hours, right? In other words, how do I, and in your working, well not that you have to, but that you may work more hours, right? So one of the things that limits the amount of labor that can be supplied at any given wage rate is your regulation. In other words, if the government says you cannot employ people for more than 20 hours a week, right, at a normal wage rate. In other words, anything more than 20 hours a week is now overtime, right? That means there can only be, labourers will only be willing to supply up to 20 hours of labour per week before wanting overtime, right? Because that's the regulation, that's what they're allowed. So that means if you want to employ more hours than that 20 hours a week, you would have to pay higher wages, right? If, however, your regulations change to say, cool, 40, instead of 40 hours a week, it's now 50 hours, you don't have to pay a higher wage, right? That means labourers would, the theory behind it would be that anyone that's willing to supply their labour now says, okay, well, I was supplying 40 hours at that wage rate. Now even if I want to supply more hours, I don't need to get paid more, right? So in other words, I don't need a higher wage to supply more labour, which means at any given wage rate, there would be more labour that's being supplied. Why does it not shift to the left? I mean, you're dealing with questions of preferences, which we haven't really spoken about, like I'm with you, like I think your thinking is cool, it's just not really part of the material, if that makes sense. In other words, that's not something that we've dealt with in the course, right? So if it's not something that we've dealt with in the course as a reason for it to shift leftwards, I'm not really sure that I would accept that as a reason for it shifting leftwards. In other words, shifting rightwards because of a change in regulation is in line with exactly what the textbook is describing. Right? Any regulation can have an adverse effect by changing people's preferences in a way that you don't expect, in which case all of this theory could potentially be thrown out of the window because it just has the completely opposite effect. But in terms of what we've done in the course material, it should shift to the right. Yeah? Okay, so what we're saying is there's some quantity of labour, choose any point along the labour supply curve. There's some quantity of labour, QL, I don't know, call this QL prime, okay? So at this wage rate, W prime, you've got QL, that's how much labour would be supplied. Okay, low wage, that's how much labour gets supplied, right? There's any number of reasons why people only are going to supply that amount of labor, right? Included in those reasons are things like regulation, okay? But in general, what regulation does is it sets an upper limit to the amount of labor that anyone can supply, right? Without some kind of overtime agreement, right? Which means if people can only, in this example where we're describing 40 hours a week, if people can only supply 40 hours a week by regulation, right? It means anyone willing to work at this wage rate can only supply 40 hours at that wage rate, because that's the regulation, for example, right? Even if they wanted to supply more hours at that same wage rate, regulation says they cannot, right? Of course, as the wage increases, more and more people are entering into the pool to say they're happy to supply their labor, but they're still limited by the same 40 hours, right? So in other words, as the wage rate increases, anyone that was prepared to supply labor at the lower wage rate is still prepared to supply labor, right? But they can still only supply 40 hours. So the increase in the quantity of labor as the wage rate gets higher is then not because people are working more hours, but because more people are now getting employed, for example, right?
Would there not be an incentive to actually work overtime, because then you get paid more? Or do companies actually have a restriction on the amount of hours you can work overtime?
I mean, there might be regulation that says that, and also companies would definitely say, okay, cool, let's pay more overtime, right? I mean, they would definitely be happy to do that. But now, once again, it's kind of like what the guy was saying there. We're like, once you start introducing all sorts of stuff that we don't know anything about, like, we can start saying anything about anything that's happening, right? All we know is that people will supply labor at a given wage rate. And if there's some regulation which limits the amount of labor that you're allowed to supply, and then you change that regulation to no longer limit that, right? The same as like retirement age, right? If your retirement age goes from 60 to 65, it now means everyone who was wanting to work between 60 and 65 but couldn't because of regulation now can work, right? Which means at any given wage rate, anyone that wanted to supply more labor can now supply more labor. So the labor supply curve shifts to the right. Yeah? If the labor supply curve shifts to the right, our equilibrium is going to shift as well. And our equilibrium is going to lead to greater quantity of labor employed, but at a lower wage rate. Okay? Okay, is everyone happy with that diagram, basically? Yeah, I'm just taking off the stuff that wasn't part of the diagram, if that makes sense, and I can't get rid of that for some reason. Oh, I see one. Okay, so in other words, right, the wage decreases and the quantity of labor increases because your labor supply has increased. Because at any given point along our labor supply curve, people are willing to supply more labor. Okay? If your economy's capital stock is destroyed, what happens? Well, remember that labor productivity, right, and labor demand are linked. Your labor demand is dependent on how productive your labor force is, because you have to pay them a wage, and that wage, their productivity has to be at least as good as their wage that you're paying them for the firm to be profitable. So if you destroy capital, they become less productive. If they become less productive, it means at any given wage rate, right, any given wage level, any point along this labor demand curve, firms are going to want to pay a lower wage. So in other words, our labor demand curve shifts to the left. So what happens to our equilibrium wage rates? Our wage rate decreases and our level of employment will also decrease because of that change in productivity. So will it decrease the equilibrium wage rates? Yes, it will. Okay. Number 3, an improvement in technology that allows workers to produce more. Well, if you've got an improvement in technology, it's going to be the reverse of this discussion here. Labor demand shifts to the right. If labor demand shifts to the right, what happens to the wage rate? The wage rate increases. So therefore, can't be option 3, because we're looking for things that decrease. A reduction in unemployment benefits. So the discussion pertaining to unemployment benefits, which again just comes from the textbook, is that when you change unemployment benefits, you change the incentives for not working, which means at any given wage rate, people are going to want to supply more labor because they have less unemployment benefit that they can fall back on. So reduction in unemployment benefits is going to shift the labor supply curve to the right. Shift to the right in labor supply lowers real wage. So the answer would be 17B. Okay. 18. All else equal, which of the following will occur in the market for loanable funds if the expected profit of investment opportunities declines? And then just assume a normal upward sloping supply of loanable funds curve. Okay, so we've got upward sloping supply of loanable funds, and you've got normal downward sloping demand for loanable funds. Which of the following will occur in the market for these funds if the expected profit of investment opportunities declines? Well, you're going to have a shift to the left, and it's difficult for me to do this because it keeps on, there we go. Shift to the left in the demand for loanable funds. Demand for loanable funds shifts to the right, no. Demand shifts to the left, yes. No change, no. Quantity supplied will increase, we'll have to come back to that. If we've shifted demand to the left, does quantity of loanable funds supplied increase? No. Will there be a shortage in the loanable funds market? Well, no, there will actually be an excess supply. I don't like just the term shortage by itself. I would prefer this to say a shortage in supply, for example, just to make that absolutely clear. So would there be a shortage in supply? No. At the original equilibrium interest rate, there would be excess supply, which means option B is the only one that's looking good. The demand for loanable funds shifts to the left, yes. Leading to a decrease in interest rates, yes. And a decrease in the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds, yes. Okay, which of the following is correct? Gross domestic product measures the output produced by factors of production owned by domestic residents, so that's all good, regardless of where their factors of production were employed. Well, that's not right. It has to be domestically, right? That's the point. Domestic. Domestic. So it can't be regardless of where those factors are employed because it's within the national boundary. National income includes all these things. No, national income does not. For a number of reasons. But indirect taxes, not really. Government revenue, I don't think that that's part of national income. I'd have to double check, but at least one thing is wrong there. Option C. GDP is a measure of all goods and services produced over some period. Well, no, it's only the final ones. So, option E, none of those are correct. And then question 20. According to the expenditure approach, GDP is the sum of household consumption spending, gross private domestic investments, government purchases, and net exports. So that looks good. Let's see, option B, household spending, yes. Net private, no. consumption of employees, gross operating surplus, consumption of fixed capital and taxes, less subsidies. Oh, sorry, this is not the expenditure approach, of course. What's wrong with option C? This is the income approach, so income, so it's obviously not C. Okay, option D, compensation of employees, net operating, same reason, it's the income approach. So income approach applies to both. Okay. And then household consumption spending, gross fixed, domestic investment. No, it's got nothing to do with the fixed. Remember, it's gross total investments. So investment here is both fixed and change in inventories. Okay. So option A is your correct option, and none of the others are workable. Yes. Yes. Okay, same question that you asked previously. Same answer as what you asked previously. Gross private investment includes changes to both fixed investment and inventories, right? Changes in inventories. In other words, investment in inventory stock, right? So if you only include the fixed component, then you are not measuring GDP properly, because you've got to have change in inventories as well. Okay? Happy? So, you happy? Okay. Yeah?
Can we go back to number 5?
Question 5, yeah?
And can I ask you to please draw the charts
Yeah?
for the correct option? Like why there's a right and shift and there's
Okay, so basically the same as what we've already seen here, but we can do it again. Okay? So you've got the labor supply and you've got labor demand. And you're getting told, first of all, an advance in technology. Are you happy that an advance in technology is one of the factors that we've discussed, and it's in the text as well? An advance in technology increases labor productivity. And if it increases labor productivity, it shifts the labor demand curve to the right. So in the same way that our previous example, when capital was destroyed, and I said that's like a negative productivity shock, it shifts labor demand to the left. Okay? An advance in technology, that's a positive technology shock. A positive technology shock shifts labor demand to the right, the opposite of what we discussed previously. Okay? You got an increase in the working age population. Okay? If you got an increase in the working age population, the same as what we discussed previously, it means that at any given wage rate, you now have more people willing to supply labor. Right? If at any given wage rate, more people are willing to supply labor, so it means at that wage, there will be more people willing to supply labor, and at this wage, there's more people willing to supply labor, right? So what have we got? We've got a shift to the right of the labor supply curve. So rightward shift of labor supply and labor demand. Yeah? You happy? You happy we've got a rightward shift of both? The advance in technology shifts labor demand. Increase in working age population shifts labor supply. Okay? Okay. You're going to have to tell me what I must explain. Correct. Remember, labor demand is based on productivity. Okay, so if you have an increase in technology, what that means is your labor force is more productive, which means at any given wage rate, right, you are going to hire more workers because they are more productive. Okay? My suggestion is to go back and read that chapter because I think it's something that you're struggling with a bit. You definitely need to go back and think about it a bit more. Anything else? Okay. Question 20, yeah. What was the issue? Okay, you happy now? Okay. All right, that was the test then. Any feedback that you want to give from that test? Okay, that took a lot longer than anticipated. That's taken us basically the entire lecture. So we can therefore take a break. As I say, Yanni is scheduled to come and start chapter 25. I had wanted to just finish off chapter 27, but we don't really have time for that now. So what we'll do is do chapter 25 now. Assuming I'm just going to run up to his office and check that he's still going to be coming down. And then tomorrow we will finish off chapter 25 and also finish off chapter 27.